So our last conversation for Outreach 2024. Sort of the genesis of this conversation was there was so much news happening in Rome over the last several months, especially as we were putting the panels together, the talks together, and we couldn't quite figure out how do we respond to the various documents coming out from the Vatican, comments from Pope Francis, events in the life of the church like the Synod. There was just a lot that was important to this community that we wanted to talk about. And in the end, we thought, what better way than to have a conversation with two people who know the inner workings of Rome better than most of us. So we are delighted to have with us for this wide-ranging conversation about news from Rome, Christopher White, who is the Vatican Correspondent for the National Catholic Reporter, and Father Jim Martin.
It's coming.
So the structure of this session is Chris and Father Jim will be in dialogue for about 35 minutes. They've just prepared some questions that they'll go back and forth and talk about some of these issues. And then we'll open it up for questions from the audience for about 20 minutes. It'll be the same setup as the previous talk. There'll be microphones stationed in each aisle. I'll signify when it's time for audience questions. If you have one, you can line up behind a microphone, and we'll get as many in as we can. So let me introduce our two conversation partners. Chris White, as I said, Vatican Correspondent for the National Catholic Reporter. His work has also appeared in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the Washington Post, Philadelphia Inquirer, Forbes, Foreign Policy, New York Daily News, International Business Times, and many other print and online publications. He regularly appears on television and radio programs, and he is a Vatican analyst for NBC and MSNBC. And personally, when I want to know what's going on in Rome, I will text Chris, and when he doesn't answer me back, I read his articles. Father James Martin certainly needs no introduction to this crowd, but for the purposes of this dialogue, I want to note that in addition to being the founder of Outreach, the editor-at-large of America, and author of the new book, Come Forth, Father Jim is also a delegate to the Synod on Synodality and a consultor to the Vatican's Dicastery for Communication. So take it away.
Thank you, Mike. Is this on? Okay, great. So we're in the middle of the presidential campaign, and unlike presidents or presidential candidates, popes don't have surrogates. But to a certain extent, I think you become a surrogate, Father Martin, for Pope Francis in communicating what he's trying to do when it comes to a lot of these issues that have been discussed this weekend. So I wanted to start us off by asking, this is a Pope who in 2013, soon after he was elected, famously said, "Who am I to judge?" when asked about the question of gay priests. He came out a few years later in support of civil unions. Then a few years after that, he signed off on a Vatican decree that said priests could not bless same-sex couples, and it included the language that said God cannot bless sin. Then just last December, he also signed off on a Vatican document that allows priests to bless couples in what the Vatican calls irregular unions, including same-sex couples. And then just a few weeks ago, said there was too much, and used a very uncouth word, in seminaries. So we see this sort of back and forth. I think Mike in one of his articles described it as whiplash. What is the Pope's grand strategy when it comes to pastoral outreach to LGBTQ Catholics?
Well, on behalf of the Pope, no, I do want to say thank you, Chris. And I want to recommend, even though he does not work for America Media, Chris's columns on the Vatican to help us understand what's going on over there. You give a very good précis of his journey with the LGBTQ community. I want to start with something that I heard. I was with the Pope in June. You probably saw the news of that meeting for comedians, which is another story. But I was able to spend time with him, and afterwards I spoke with our Vatican correspondent, a friend of Chris's named Jerry O'Connell. And he said, that is the least homophobic person I've ever met. Now, Jerry is also a friend of the Pope, but I think it's important to see his progression in terms of dealing with ministering to LGBTQ community. As you said, he's also the first Pope ever to use the word gay publicly, to add to some of the précis that you sketched out. He has appointed an openly gay man, Juan Carlos Cruz, who spoke to us last year on one of his panels. He meets, and Don Andrea, are you here? Don Andrea, is Don Andrea here? Can you stand up, please? So Don Andrea Conacchia brings to Pope Francis transgender people every month. Grazie. So I think one of the most, and he has encouraged the outreach ministry. Obviously, he wrote to us. He's met with Sister Janine recently, and Frank DiBernardo, and I think Bob Shine as well from New Ways Ministry. He meets with me regularly. This is a person who really has a pastoral heart, who knows LGBTQ people, but is also, two things I think we have to understand about the Pope is he's very much against, and he brings this up with me regularly, anything that smacks of what he calls ideology. Okay, so he's against ideologies, and that can mean many things to him at different times. He's most focused on the pastoral. That's something to really keep in mind with the Pope. The other thing, and this is something we can talk about in a bit, and I'd be curious to hear what you have to say. He's also someone who has to balance different dioceses and bishops, right? So something that might seem lukewarm or tepid in the United States, in sub-Saharan Africa and in Eastern Europe is white hot, right? So even, for example, at the Synod, using the term LGBTQ was really difficult for a lot of people. And so we have a Pope who has to balance these things, who has to balance prophecy and unity, right? He has to take care of all parts of the church. But I'd be curious about your answer to that question. How do you see his, shall we say, progression in his ministering to LGBTQ people?
Well, as a reporter, I try not to share my opinions. I get to ask people questions. But I think one thing that seems very clear to me is that if you look back over the last 10 years of this papacy, the Pope has really, to use your language, really tried to expand pastoral outreach. So we saw this in 2014 and 2015 with the two synods on the family and the outcome document of that, Amoris Laetitia, which among other things allowed for divorced couples in certain circumstances to receive communion. We saw this at this past synod on the question of polygamy, which I think was an undercover topic at the Synod on Synodality last October, but a burning issue in Africa. And I think we see this on the question of gay blessings, that the Pope's general reflex, it seems to me, is how can I maximize space for priests in particular to use pastoral discretion? And I think that has been consistent, regardless of the population, divorced, remarried, gay, any sort of population. I think that's what the Pope has tried to do. But in carving out that space, there's been a lot of inconsistencies in the practice. So what happens in Africa looks very different than what's happening here in the U.S., and what happens in the U.S. looks different than what's happening in Eastern Europe. And I think that inconsistency has fueled a lot of the opposition to Francis, and certainly led folks to say this is why the Pope is creating confusion. And so I'm going to turn it back to you now. You know, you've been a part of this synod process, which has been going on now for almost 4 years, which for the first time ever in church life has put a lot of these questions that couldn't even be discussed on the table, and they're being discussed inside the Vatican. And I think it's noticeable what is being discussed by the very people and offices that once investigated people who said these things. So I think we have to sort of step back and say there's certainly been a change in the atmosphere and in the manner in which conversations can take place. But the Synod is coming to a conclusion this October. We just had the working document released a month ago. It doesn't even mention LGBTQ. Is this a dead issue for the Synod? Is this a dead issue for the Pope at this late stage in his papacy? where do you think the Pope wants to go in this regard in the time that he might have left?
Well, I don't think it's a dead issue, and I think the Pope really wants us to listen to the voice of the Spirit. And maybe I'll give you a little bit of a journey of where the LGBTQ issue has been in the Synod. So, as you know, the first step was these listening sessions in parishes and dioceses that happen in some places very well, in some places not so very well. And at the Synod we were told, which makes sense, this is the first time that anything like this has been happening, right? This is the history's largest consultative meeting ever, right? I mean, it really is. So it's not surprising that and I'm sure in some of your parishes and some of your dioceses at the beginning, it felt like it was kind of, took a while to kind of get going. Okay, nonetheless, all of these responses from dioceses and parishes were gathered together at the diocesan level, and then for the United States at the USCCB level. And the USCCB's first document did mention LGBTQ people and actually was quite open. Then there was a continental stage, and then the first working document where LGBTQ issues were mentioned twice. And it was not just an issue of the West, it was an issue from all over. They, in fact, quoted people from, I think, sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, so we go to the Synod, and we have this working document, also the Instrumentum Laboris, sounds much better when you say it that way. And what happened on the floor, which was not really reflected in the synthesis report, that was the final document, was that, and I do want to share this, was that there was a tremendous amount of conversation about this topic, okay? And how did it sort of play out? As I would say, or as I saw it, I would say probably about 65 to 70% of the people there, the delegates, okay, and this is not just cardinals, archbishops, and bishops, but for the first time, as you know, lay people, plain old priests like me, women, right, all of us who had sort of voting rights. I would say about 60 to 70% of those people wanted some form of welcome to LGBTQ people, broadly speaking, okay, that they recognize that need in the church. There was another percentage, say 15%, what do we got, 85%, 15%, who were extremely interested in having LGBTQ people welcomed. I would count myself in that group. I mean, very, very strong about it. Strong, vocal, talked about stories with LGBTQ people. And then there were 15% who were extremely against it. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is people particularly from sub-Saharan Africa and Eastern Europe and also parts of the United States who felt that, and it's important for us to understand this, that the LGBTQ ideology, which is how they framed it, is a form of colonialism and an ideology, and it is a kind of humiliation. Now, why is that? How could they say that? Because oftentimes in some of their countries, aid packages from the United States, for example, and other Western countries force them to accept LGBTQ rights. They feel that that is colonialism because, as they explain it, I don't agree with this, but this is their approach. In our culture, we don't have that, and so you, Western people, are forcing this on us. And so there are some extremely strong presentations against LGBTQ people, not even using that term. At one point, at one of my tables, with a sympathetic and open bishop, he said, well, why don't we just say people who identify as LGBTQ? And I said to him, well, Bishop, do you identify as a bishop? And he said, no, I am a bishop. And I said, exactly, right? So even those kinds of discussions were difficult. Now, the synthesis report came out. LGBTQ was not mentioned. Why was that? Because each paragraph of the synthesis report that came out last year had to be voted on and had to be approved by a 2/3 majority. Okay, this may all sound very kind of boring and juridical, but it actually impacts what was finally printed, what was finally published. The people who wrote the document, who were a group of theologians and writers, realized that if they put in the paragraph that talked about very openly gender and sexuality, if they used the term LGBTQ, it would be voted down. And they were right. And so if you look at, I think it's part 15, they use gender and sexuality and talk about a need for new anthropology without using the term LGBT. Okay, so that's last October, that happens. Why, and I'm sorry for this long response, why was there so much of a kind of almost loud response? I saw it more or less as a kind of coming out, to your point, that this is the first time in really a church body that these issues were discussed. For all of you who have come out, right, you know sometimes it's a kind of, initially it's kind of an explosive discussion, right? There's a lot of emotions. This is sort of what was happening at the Synod. This is the first time for a lot of these bishops and cardinals in particular that they are actually, I would say, forced to listen to stories from LGBTQ people. It was very emotional for them, right? And so it was almost a kind of coming out. All right, so that's last October. In the meantime, there's been more discussion, more synthesis, and more diocesan reports. Also, there was a meeting of parish priests, 300 parish priests who were brought to Rome. All of that was coordinated into a new working document, which Chris just mentioned. At the same time, the Holy Father decided, and with the Synod, that some of these neuralgic issues, 10 issues that were talked about in the synthesis document, would now be given to study groups. Okay, so these issues, including controversial theological issues, the rubric under which LGBTQ issues are sort of categorized, would be given to study groups. Now, what does that mean? It means that a lot of the actual topics that we were talking about, lay participation, women's diaconate, clericalism, have been taken off the plate of the Synod for October, and we will now discuss synodality in itself, right? Now, one more thing and I will shut up. There are positives and negatives about this. I initially was quite disappointed that the meat of the Synod, after, as you said, 4 years, why would we not be able to talk about these topics that we've been discussing and thinking about for the last 4 years? Isn't that the point, right? And in a sense, it is a negative because we have taken it away from the very body that's supposed to be discussing these things. But when I was in Rome in June, a couple people from the Synod said, now think about this. These are 10 very complicated issues. For example, the relations between the Eastern churches and the Western churches. We have, Father James, they call me, we have, Father James, 20 days in Rome with 300 people who have more or less or varying degrees of expertise on these things. Do you think that we are going to be able to decide all these things and discuss all these things and come to a decision, in 20 days? So it's not a bad point. So pluses and minuses with these study groups. So it is not a dead issue for the Synod. It is now part of one of these study groups. I think it's going to come up anyway, because as we talk about synodality, we talk about listening. And I think that there are going to be people there, including myself, who are going to want to bring that to the table. But why does the Pope want to do it this way? Because he trusts the Holy Spirit. He really believes the Holy Spirit is active. At the same time, he himself is doing things like sending a letter to outreach, right? Cardinal Fernandez, the head of the Dicastery for the Doctrine of Faith, is doing his own things too. So the Synod and the Holy Father and Vatican offices are, I would say, also sort of on parallel tracks. So it's not just the Synod that is making decisions. What would you say to that? Do you see it as happening that way, or?
Yeah, I think the study groups present a very difficult problem for the Synod, in my view, because the Synod has issued this call for greater transparency in the life of the Church. And on the key study group that's dealing with a lot of these most sensitive questions, there has been anything but transparency. And so I feel as if it's failing to practice what it's preaching in this regard. And as a reporter, that makes me very allergic to the way they're operating. That being said, I think if you talk to those that are actually organizing the Synod, there is a great desire on their part for there to be open discussion about all of the questions that have surfaced over the past 4 years, including this issue. So related to that, I wanted to ask you, one of the things that the Synod working document puts forth is a chief goal of this October is to decide what can be dealt with at a local level versus what can be dealt with, or what must be dealt with at the universal level. And you talked earlier about the Pope's desire to balance prophecy and unity. Is this an issue, or are these issues that can be dealt with just at a local level, or do they require a universal response? It seems to me that a universal response might break the church at this point, because we've seen these fractures in Africa and Eastern Europe. And it seems that the Pope is trying to thread a needle here, and I don't know how that's going to play out.
I think he is, and I think you see that in the response to Fiducia Supplicans. So I just was happy to bless two couples this morning, which I would not have been able to do 2 or 3 years ago, right? So that is a decided change. As you know, one of the African Bishops' Conferences, CCAM, came out with a document saying we would not recognize this, or we would not implement it, I would say, in our dioceses in Africa. And they did that with the approval of the Vatican, which was quite unusual, right? For the Vatican, for the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, to come out with a document and to have a large part of the church say, we will not implement that. Now, interestingly, a fairly progressive theologian I know, who will remain nameless, said, well, you know, we're always talking about local responses and having the church be more local and subsidiarity, and so maybe this is a good thing. Interesting way of looking at it. I think what has happened is the Pope has I'm not speaking for the Pope. I think people in the Vatican and the Pope who want to move this ahead realize that there are certain places who, according to the bishops, say that we are not ready for this. And I do think that if he forced it, it would be have a quite violent reaction in Africa. So I'm guessing that his way of looking at this, and again, I have not talked to him about Fiducia Supplicans. I would imagine his way of looking at this is, look, the document is out there. The Vatican has given permission for priests to bless same-sex couples, right? And when these dioceses and bishops' conferences are ready, it will be there for them. But you're right, he does not want to sort of break the church over this. But I will say, let me just say one thing. My meetings with him, and I think Janine will agree, I mean, this is a very pastoral, opening, listening person who consistently encourages us to continue our ministry. I want to just put this in context. When I wrote to him a couple of weeks ago to just send greetings to the conference, he wrote the next day. Okay? When I met with him in June, we spent about half of our time talking about his comments about gay priests. I'm glad I remember this. Let me just say one more thing. This is, for me, this is who this person is. And also, he's on a journey. He's an 87-year-old Argentine former Jesuit provincial, okay, with all that comes with, right? Let me say one thing. I'm glad I remembered to tell this. Long story short, I was asked to help the Dicastery for Culture and Education put together this meeting with comedians, which was lovely, and that's a whole other story. When I was over there, I wrote to him and I said, would you be able to see me? Right back, yes, this is when I can see you, this time. And he saw me for an hour with 2 friends who were translators. We spent the first half hour talking about the gay priest's comments and the language he used. And I can say this, and he said to me, I said, well, maybe it would be helpful for you to say that you know gay priests. He said, well, you can say that. This is all in Spanish. I don't speak Spanish very well. You can say that. And I said, wait a minute. I can say that you know good, holy, and faithful gay priests. And this is the way he acts. Of course, why wouldn't you say that? That's because that's what I believe. Of course you can say that. And I said to my friend, the translator, so just be sure. And the translator said, who's a friend of mine, said, he said that. Go and say that. Move on. So in other words, of course you can say that because that's what I believe. And then we talked about the use of that term that he used, which I would say, until we talked to him, he didn't quite understand the import of it. That's what I will say about that. Anyway, and the next part of the conversation was about the U.S. Church, which I will not talk about. But I want to say this. This for me is who this person is. So that was on a Monday. I really treasure these meetings with him. That was on a Monday. He allowed me to put out, you may have seen on social media, I know good, holy, celibate, faithful gay priests, with a picture of us. On Friday, we had the meeting of the comedians in the Sala Clementina, I guess it is. And everybody goes up for what they call the Bachamana, right? Everybody gets their handshake by the Pope. And I was in that meeting, and I don't think he expected to see me there. And I came up, and he had this big laugh, and he said, "Oh, famoso comico americano," So ha ha ha, and then everyone knows that you only spend a few seconds with him. And I go to leave, and he pulls me back and sends in Spanish, which I understood, "Thank you for that conversation. That was very helpful for me." And then went like this. And you can see it, I posted it. Why am I telling you that? That's the kind of person he is. How many of us in this room would say to someone, "Thank you for that difficult conversation. I learned a lot." So this is who we're dealing with. And Father Bill said last night when we want to cancel him or say, "Oh, how can he say this?" This is who he is. This is this person who wants to be pastoral and open and listening, but listening to everybody in the church.
He is listening to everyone. We do seem to get some mixed signals on the question of gay priests or gay seminarians. And that's obviously a topic at the Synod. Dioceses across the world are dealing with this question. It's led to, I think, as we just said, the Pope's most shameful moments when it comes to this issue because of the language that he's used. Where do you expect the conversation specifically on the admission of gay seminarians into seminary to go?
Yeah, so one of the problems is that there are, for many reasons, not very many openly gay priests, right? We had one speak to us last night. There are many reasons for that. The simplest reason, there are many reasons. One, bishops won't let them, religious superiors won't let them. They feel embarrassed doing it. They don't think it's anyone's business, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of reasons for that. That means there are very few models of open, healthy, celibate, faithful gay priests, which is why I thought it was so important that the Pope enabled me or gave me permission to say that. There's a document that says that men with deep-seated homosexual tendencies should not be admitted to seminaries. Now, that's been interpreted, Amy Jill was talking about interpretation, 3 ways. 1, no one who's homosexual, okay? 2, no one who is homosexual who cannot live celibately. Many seminary rectors look at it that way. 3, no one for whom homosexuality is the most important thing should be admitted. Okay, so if your entire identity is about being gay, that should not be someone who is admitted to the seminary. I would hope that with the Pope being more open about gay seminarians, that it becomes more discussed. But there's a lot of resistance, especially in those places in the world that I talked about. So I don't know where it's going to go. I think the more priests, and we've run stories on this in outreach, that are open about it, the better, because it gives people models. But I also have to say that I think there's a sort of strain now in some younger seminarians to not talk about it. I think one of the most unfortunate things is when you have seminarians who tell me that I cannot discuss this with my rector or my spiritual director. That, I think, is just a recipe for disaster. So I would hope that it becomes more and more open. It's certainly being talked about more. So we'll see. But again, these different churches exist in different cultures. And the seminaries reflect their local cultures. Yeah.
I think that's right. I mean, I think it's hard to overstate the amount of fear that most seminarians experience because, particularly the ones that are brought to Rome to study because they are told they are on a fast track basically to become bishops. And so what they do then is they guard themselves intensely and don't reckon with who they are, whether it's their sexuality or a range of other issues. And I think, whether it's, sexuality or just, any other issue, that is something I think the Pope is trying to purge seminaries of. But that's going to be a battle that will be fought by his successor. So.
Yeah, and I think it's important, again, to see what the Pope is dealing with and what kind of risks he takes and how he puts himself out there, even by writing a note to us. I mean, this comes with a great cost for him. Ecclesially, personally, I know people kind of push back. And I think we have to really understand where he finds himself. And I'll tell you, at the Synod, we were talking about this earlier. At the Synod, I had someone who refused to sit next to me at the Synod, where we're supposed to be dialoguing. And this person saw where he was seated next to me and said, I can say this because and I know you reported it because it was public, I'm not sitting next to him. And then left the aula, left the Synod, right?
And didn't return for the duration
and did not
of the Synod.
return. He came back for the final Mass. So I think it's important to see for us where the world that the Pope is living in, right? I mean, this is someone who is part of the Catholic Church, and this is someone with whom the Pope has to speak, right? So it's a great balancing act, and I think sometimes that, I get impatient as well, right? But this is where we are in the Church now. So, to answer your question, I think he's moving ahead, as they say in the Jesuits, make haste slowly. Right? He's trying to move it ahead without breaking the Church. But I have to say, for me, this is the Pope that has done the most for LGBTQ people, I think, probably combined with all the other popes in history.
I have a colleague, Robert Mickens, who used to be a longtime correspondent for La Croix and also The Tablet. And he's a former seminarian, openly gay. And one of the things that he wrote after Fiducia Supplicans last December was that the Pope did that, authorizing priests to bless those in same-sex couples, as much for the couples as for the priests themselves, because there are so many closeted priests. And I'm curious how that resonates with you.
That's interesting. I would put a little different spin on that. I would say it's as much for the couples as for the priests who felt unable to do that, right? So I think it's giving latitude to priests. And again, for people who say, and I know there was a lot of pushback and then there was a lot of refinement, but a reporter said to me, oh, well, there's not much difference. And I said, yes, because the day before I couldn't do that, and today I can. I think that's an immense step forward, because if you think about it theologically, Amy Jill was talking about how things are interpreted. If you think about it theologically, it's basically saying we find something good in same-sex couples, right, who can be blessed. And that is a significant, as you pointed out, Chris, turnaround from God does not bless sin. So remember that document came out, and the Pope has really turned that around. And so in a sense, I don't think we should be surprised that there is such a reaction in sub-Saharan Africa and Eastern Europe. It would be surprising if there weren't a reaction. But again, like coming out, it's something that we're working through as a church.
Okay, how about a round of applause for Chris and Father Jim? If that felt freewheeling and unscripted, it's because it was. We did not prepare the questions in advance. So thank you both for your generosity in talking about all sorts of subjects. And now it's your turn to ask questions, which are also unscripted. So there's 3 microphones set up. If folks want to make their way to one of the 3 microphones and ask a question, we'll start right here in the middle, and then we'll probably just alternate back and forth, but I'll call on folks if they have questions.
Father Jim and Chris, thank you very much for this session, and thank you very much for this weekend. Father Jim, have you ever had the opportunity to talk to Pope Francis about Dignitas Infinita, and particularly the hurtful language that the document contains with respect to categorizing transgender people?
I haven't spoken with him, but I have exchanged correspondence with him, not about Dignitas Infinita, but about transgender people. And one of my constant comments to him, which he's open to, is that it is not an ideology. And I also spoke to the Dicastery for Education about that a couple years ago. But I have to say, and it is Christine out there. Is that who I'm seeing? Yeah, hi, Christine. that I think Don Andrea's work is probably the way that these things will change, which is the Pope meeting regularly with transgender people. You know, for me, I think that's the leading edge, you know, the theology of transgender people in the Vatican. And I would say that, you know, there were some people at the Synod who I don't want to say but even the idea of homosexuality was difficult, right? And so the question of transgender is kind of the leading edge. But I think the way that the theology will change is through personal interaction, and he is certainly doing that. But no, I have not talked about that with him directly. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll just add, if
Chris.
I may, you know, one of the things that came out was a few weeks after Dignitas Infinita was released, was Sister Janine had correspondence with Pope Francis. And he specifically said in the correspondence which Sister Janine in New Ways made public was that transgender people must be accepted and integrated. And that position alone, that they exist and should be accepted, puts him at odds with the number of high-ranking Vatican officials. But I think that is probably the most definitive thing he has said on the topic, just acknowledging that one, transgender people exist and should be accepted.
And then the document, what was the document that said they can be godparents? And
that came out even before Dignitas Infinita, but yes, it was the doctrinal office releasing a note about 6 months ago allowing for transgender people to serve as, you know, godparents and in various other capacities.
Yep.
Hi, Brother Christian.
Sorry, brother. We have three stations, so we're going to bounce over here, and then we'll come back and then back. So over here.
So this question's kind of about like authority. So in terms of, it's like taking Africa, for instance, where you've got the Vatican saying yes to blessings, the local bishops are saying, no, we're not going to do that. And then let's say you have a priest who wants to still do that blessing in Africa. Kind of an analog to that in the United States, you know, you've got these more positive statements from Pope Francis. Let's say you have a more conservative bishop who is really pushing back against any sort of inclusion or acceptance of LGBT people. And then you've got a local population that wants to do work there. Sort of how do you balance the realities of the larger church with sort of the realities of your local church when they are at odds like that?
I'm the reporter, I don't solve the problems, Jim.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a question of authority, isn't it? You know, because a bishop, for example, when I celebrated Mass this morning, which was a joy to do, I needed to get, as a matter of course, a letter. It was called a letter of good standing, which I sent to the Archdiocese of Washington. So even sort of, you know, having the authority to say who can and who cannot say Mass in the Archdiocese is under the bishop's rubric. So yeah, there are clearly bishops in the United States who have taken dim views of Fiducia Supplicans in particular. But I think confronted with those things, we have to say, look, this is a teaching of the church now, right? And it's unfortunate that some bishops feel that they have to dig their heels in, but that the Pope is, what do they call him? Whatever in canon law, he's the ultimate, you may know that.
He's the supreme legislator.
He's the supreme legislator. And so that really needs to be taken into consideration. So there are some things that can be done and not done based on the bishop's authority, but there are some things that the Pope does have authority over. So, yeah.
And I would add that the Vatican and the Pope himself did themselves no favors in the way in which Fiducia Supplicans was rolled out. This was a groundbreaking, major document that came out at 2 o'clock on a Monday afternoon without any sort of formal press conference. And the Pope and Cardinal Fernandez kept that document tightly wrapped so that the Pope and the Pope's closest advisors did not know that it was about to be released. And that's really unusual for a Vatican document. So because of that, there's been, I think, an even steeper learning curve, or a greater difficulties we've seen in the way in which it's been received because of the fact that it was such a shock to the system.
Great. We'll come over to this side.
Could you speak more to the issue of when the diocesan priest went to Rome for their meeting? Because in many pews in America, there are many Catholics who don't even know what the word synod is. And if this whole thing is going to actually work, it's got to be in the local churches on an every Sunday basis?
Yeah, sure. Actually, it's funny enough, we couldn't even decide how to pronounce the word synodal or synodal. We went back and forth on that. So I'm not making light of your question, but yes. What happened was, and I think it was kind of a shock to people. There were 350 delegates. 70 of us were appointed by the church. The others were appointed by their local bishops' conferences. So, for example, the USCCB appointed, say, however many, 7 or 8. How many? Five. And then the Holy Father appointed his own people, okay, including Cardinal Gregory, me, Cardinal Supich, Cardinal McElroy, a few others. When we got there, maybe they knew this, but when we got there, we realized that many of the priests who were there were kind of there ex officio. So the head of the office of the blah, 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 and the bishop's conference of blah, 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 right? I think there were no parish priests there. And that became evident. So there were lots of lay women, lay theologians, all sorts of different people. That became evident very quickly. And one of the things that was lamented was that we are talking often about things that happen in the parishes, right? And a number of people said over and over, why don't we have parish priests here? We had one deacon who was not there representing deacons. He was there because and there's friends of his here, who happened to be a deacon. So what the Vatican and the Office of the Synod decided wisely was we need the voices of parish priests. And so they had a meeting a couple months, April, to bring 300 parish priests together to have a kind of mini synod and to sort of contribute something. So I think that was very wise because that was a huge lacuna.
And what did they contribute? What was the outcome of that?
Well, like all Vatican events, it ended in a document. And the document was basically the summations of these discussions. Basically, they took the format of last October's synod and reduced it down for basically a week-long sort of session. And if you look at the working document for next fall, that document is cited throughout it. So the thought is that they wanted to be sure that when they set the agenda for next fall, that it at least incorporated the perspective of parish priests around the world. So I would say that was their biggest contribution. But I can tell you one of the things that a group of those parish priests specifically requested was that they actually have a presence and an invitation to participate in the synod in October. And to date, that invitation has not been extended.
Let me say one more thing about the synod, because I want to sort of, I don't want to not say this. One of the reasons that the topics, the individual topics, the 10 topics were taken off the table was in order that the synod delegates in October could concentrate on synodality, okay, which sounds like us just talking about how we have meetings. The thinking is, which I think is a reasonable predicate, is that if the church becomes more synodal, more listening, more participatory, this is the way that change will happen. And so, in fact, this is more important to change the way the church is, to change the way the church operates, than the particulars of these different topics. Not that they're not interesting or important, but that lasting change, fundamental change, really kind of radical change will come from making the church more synodal. So it's more of a long-term perspective. That's the thinking.
Great.
Your Jesuit confrere, Father Tom Rees, was really dogged about this last October at the Synod. At almost every press conference, his hand shot up, and regardless of who was on the dais, Tom would ask, how is this going to translate to the parish level? And I think there is this sort of slow realization among the Synod office that anything that happens in Rome, for it to have any effect at the ground, has to really be embraced by parish priests.
Great, we can go back to the center.
Hi, Brother Christian. Jumping on Christine's earlier question, when at the time, Congregation for Catholic Education came out with their document, Male and Female, he created them in 2019, the prefect admitted that they hadn't spoken to any transgender people or even seen the need to. And with Dignitas Infinita, it also appeared that there was no consultation with transgender people. I'm wondering, one, if either of you know of any additional transgender-related documents that are being prepared by the Vatican, but two, and more importantly, are you aware of any willingness on the part of Pope Francis or anyone at any of the dicasteries to actually speak with transgender or cisgender theologians, academics, scientists, bioethicists on this topic?
I don't know of any other documents that are coming out about that. And we might say, and I'm not making light of your question, we might say, for now, that might be a good thing, right? Because if they are sort of forced, sort of with their backs against the wall to come up with something right now, without doing a lot of consultation with transgender people, we might not like what comes out, okay? As for them consulting with people, I'm not sure. I don't know about that. I mean, you can talk to Don Andrea, who I think, as I said, I think currently the most fruitful path forward is the personal interaction, which the Pope is doing himself. How many other people do that in the Vatican? I don't really know. So, yeah. Do you know any?
When you talk to Vatican officials after Dignitas came out, and said, look, this document doesn't seem to model what, the Pope has called for, dialogue, consultation, the standard reply was always, the Pope regularly meets, with the folks Don Andrea brings them. And the criticism of that has been frequently repeated is that, but what about the theologians? What about those that work on this? And to date, you certainly don't see their voices reflected in the membership of, say, the dicastery of for the doctrine of the faith. That is certainly lacking. So.
Thank you.
We'll go over to Katie.
Thank you both for the excellent conversation. Katie Scott from NCR. Chris, you mentioned the letter to Sister Janine from of New Ways Ministry, and how in that letter he kind of clarifies what he means about gender ideology. And there seemed to be kind of a huge gap in terms of how it's being wielded, particularly I'm aware of in the United States, around policies that address people who are transgender. I was wondering, one, and it's also been described as sort of this linguistic basket in which everything sexual that's bad is dumped. What do you see as the Pope's understanding of the term? Can you flesh that out a little bit? And two, does he understand how it's being wielded, particularly in the United States?
Well, Sister Janine, the letter is public. It's on New Ways, and she published it also at the National Catholic Reporter. And she specifically, has a paragraph in that letter telling the Pope, specifically how most people interpret that phrase in the United States. It's quite interesting in Dignitas, there is no definition of gender ideology. Unfortunately, the Pope does not really have any way to sort of answer questions, except when he travels and we have a press conference. And the Pope has not gone on any international trips to be asked about these things in the time that's elapsed since that document came out. I suspect next month when we go to Asia and Oceania, that will be the first time the Pope meets the press in over a year. And I think Dignitas Fiducia, and particularly his comments regarding seminarians, is going to dominate most of that press conference. So stay tuned.
Come over to this side.
Hi. Thank you guys so much for that conversation. It was absolutely wonderful. I just wanted to raise the word lesbian, which I haven't heard mentioned yet, but it is the first letter of LGBTQ. And I also noticed no references to closeted lesbian priests or any discussion of the ordination of lesbians or indeed of women. Anyway, I'm thrilled about emerging transgender theologies and ways of looking at the world. And I'm wondering, where can women, lesbians, trans women, how do we become part of those conversations with, how do we enter into the clerical conversations of our specific existence and the specific gifts we bring to the church, and do this with, I love what Francis has done so far in many ways. How do we, as females, present ourselves to this 87-year-old Argentinian who's one of the brightest faces of the Gentlemen's Club? Probably won't see you again, but just thought I'd say something.
Yeah, I often say that as a male reporter covering the Vatican, I have an easier job than my colleagues who are women, because Vatican officials are much more likely to feel more comfortable just sitting down and having conversations. So imagine that happening, at every level in the church, certainly to the Pope. I think the person that's had the Pope's ear more than anyone is an openly gay man named Juan Carlos Cruz. And there isn't a lesbian that we know of speaking in the Pope's ear in the same way that Juan Carlos has been these past 5 or 6 years. So that's just the reality and sort of how I see the situation. I don't know what advice you might have to offer.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I also think that one of the great open doors is now the Synod. Now that women, and we could say, someone said to me, one of the complaints about the Synod was I felt I'm pretty sure that the reason the Pope appointed me was because of this outreach work, right? And someone said, well, there aren't any out LGBTQ people here in the Synod. I said, how do you know? I don't know all these people. So, there may have been, for example, among the women theologians, of which there were many, and the women religious, of which there were very many, there may have been lesbians among them. But I think that's the opening. The opening is the Synod and now having women have a full vote. One of the bishops said something to me really powerful, which was, there's no going back now. In other words, the idea of having a Synod without women and without lay people is kind of unthinkable. Now, that not every bishop thinks that, but I think that the door has now been opened. So I think that's probably the place where you would see that the most. You would see that kind of input the most, yeah. But it is still, as my friend Sister Janice Farnham says, it's still very much the boys' club over there, That's very true. It's yeah. Yeah.
Okay, we'll come to the center here.
Hello, thank you very much, Father Jim. I'm Willy Bombik from Belgium. Thank you so much for what you're doing. You're a big inspiration for me and for a lot of us in Europe. We read your book, Building a Bridge, and everywhere I go, it's always the same, and we work on that. Thank you for that. My question is about the expert group. We know that the theme of LGBT will be discussed there. Do we know which kind of experts, who are these experts who will sit there? Will there be, again, people who do have some notion about it, or are really also members of the LGBT Catholics will be present to talk about our theme, our situation? Thank you.
That's a great question. So with the exception of the study group on the female diaconate, because I think it's the DDF that has taken that over, right? So it's basically that's the study group for that, as I understand it. You may be able to refine that. The study group for all the names of the study groups were just kind of. It wasn't like a press release. It was just kind of suddenly it appeared.
At the end of a Vatican press conference after reporters could no longer ask questions, and I'm a little bitter. So it's there. So you can find the list, and I do know that there are like 5 or 6 on each study group. Yeah, on the list on the study group for controversial theological issues, I do know is a guy named Carlo. This is public. Is Carlo Casalone. Who is a Jesuit physician, moral theologian, and former provincial of Italy, who's very thoughtful, right, and very open to these. I can't speak for him, but so there's at least one person who I know in that group who's a very thoughtful person and a very intelligent moral theologian on these issues. I think one of the problems with the LGBTQ question, it's now lumped in with like every other controversial topic. But really, I think the controversial topic that they'd be talking about is this, because that was, as I said, a major topic of the Synod.
Great, we'll go back over here.
Hi, my name is Jack Consoli. I'm curious about lay ecclesial ministry, and in particular, queer people in lay ecclesial ministry. Unlike seminaries, right, which have this question of deep-seated homosexual tendencies, lay ecclesial ministers are pretty much at the risk of the approval of their local priest, if not their local bishop. And I was wondering if for queer ministers, for queer lay ecclesial ministers, is there any hope or sign of hope for more protection in that regard for them to continue to do their work, not only in things like Catholic schools, but even from things as being catechists, working in their parishes, being Eucharistic ministers. Is there any hope for more protection for them in that regard?
I think it's a great and very complicated question because it touches on the Vatican's approach to this. It touches on local bishops' approach, which, as you know, varies widely, right? It touches on the pastor's approach, the parish council, the culture, the parish itself, right? How out or public. There are people here who have suffered from that within the parish you are, teachers, people in the pastoral council. I think that, yes, I definitely think there is hope. And why do I think that? I think because there's two trends that are going on in the church right now. The first trend can be summarized in two words, Pope and Francis, okay? And Pope Francis, by his constant, really frequent commentating on this, even as I said, this letter to us, is sending notice, as he can, right, to bishops, right, and cardinals and archbishops and lay leaders. I take this community seriously. I am united with you in prayer, all right? That's pushing things ahead, all right? Now, it may not be pushing things ahead as much as we want in some dioceses, and that trend could change, God forbid, tomorrow, right? If, God forbid, he dies, all right? The second trend is that more and more people are coming out. And it is just a matter of time before that happens all over the world. So I think those two trends are moving towards more and more openness. Are there pockets of resistance? Absolutely. Does it feel like in some places we're going backwards? Absolutely. But more and more people are coming out. I want to say one phenomenon that I think is underreported. Here, both of you are reporters. Feel free to take this up. It's true, though. As more and more people come out, okay, men and women, trans, more and more priests and sisters and brothers and bishops and cardinals have nieces and nephews who are gay or who are LGBTQ. Now, that's a big change, and that necessarily changes how people in authority, right, understand this community. I'll tell you one quick story. I was out with a priest years ago after the Building a Bridge book came out, and he was a bishop who had been I'll just leave it vague. He was a bishop who was asked to vet me and vet the book, okay? So we went out to lunch, and we had he's very friendly, but he said, I just want to understand where you're coming from on behalf of my bishop. I said, fine. So we went back and forth. I'm not challenging any church teaching. This is what I'm doing, blah, blah, blah. It was not hostile, but it was tough. It was a challenging conversation. At the very end, he said, now I want to put my cards on the table, says this bishop who had been kind of grilling me. My favorite nephew is gay, and I'm having dinner with him and his partner tonight. So that necessarily changes him, right? And I think that small facet is helping to change the church, and I think that's only going to grow. So.
Okay, we have time for one more quick question. I know you've been staying for a while, and then we'll wrap up.
It's quick. I'm Donna Beach from Pennsylvania and Delaware. I'm the very grateful parent of a transgender daughter, and I just have a request, Father Martin, that at some point could you ask the Pope or tell the Pope that there are many of us parents who deeply love and admire our LGBT kids and would gratefully serve as mediators while the church continues to hash everything out. But the church expectation or implication that we need to choose between our church and our children doesn't help anyone.
Let me just say, yes. Let me say one thing about that. I have said more or less the same thing to the Pope over the years. And I'd like to ask Sister Janine and Don Andre to stand up. Could you stand up, please, two of you? And I would say, tell me your name again.
Donna Beach.
Donna, thank you. So Donna, I would say, and so have these two people, in person, in letters, and with Don Andrea multiple times. So there are people, truly, in this room, more of whom than just Don Andrea and Sister Janine, who are doing that in person. And as I said, he is listening. So please be assured of that. Anyway, thank you. Grazie.
Okay, well, Chris, thank you for visiting us all the way from Rome. Father Jim, thank you for answering so many questions. Thank you all for your wonderful questions and this great conversation. Okay, friends, our time together has almost come to an end. As I mentioned on Friday night when we first gathered, Outreach 2024 could not have happened without the support of many friends and benefactors who help us pull this whole conference together. And I want to just thank them one more time. Our leadership sponsors for this conference included Gilead, Conference Direct, Clear Faith Publishing, Jim O'Connor in memory of his late husband, Carlos Cuartez, Holy Trinity Catholic Church, and the Boston College Clough School of Theology and Ministry. When I spoke to you Friday night, I said that the goals of Outreach and the goals of this conference were the same, that we sought to celebrate, elevate, and build up the LGBTQ Catholic community. As I was looking around at Mass this morning, I was situated in a space where I could look out into the congregation and see almost everyone there. And during the recessional, I looked out and saw hundreds of smiling, singing faces. LGBTQ Catholics, their families, their friends. It was truly a moment of celebration, and I allowed myself a couple seconds to forget about all the worries of the conference, all the logistical challenges, everything that had to be done, and enjoy that view, because it was truly a moment of celebration. Thank you for your participation in all the events we put together, the liturgies, the prayer services. There was a big team of folks who made everything happen, our volunteer liturgical ministers, the choir, the staffs, and the volunteers at Holy Trinity, at Dahlgren Chapel, Michael Rizicki and Meredith Augustine, who planned these services. Thank you for participating and for singing. That was truly a moment of celebration. Elevating. We want to elevate the voices of LGBTQ Catholics because we have so much to offer the church, our friends and families and allies, by being out there, by reminding people how welcoming the church can be, how when we live up to the best of our gospel ideals and values, it's a better church for everyone. I had a chance yesterday to pop into different panels to listen to the experiences of people serving as panelists, to the reporters moderating the panels, and there was this moment when I realized we are elevating these voices. Your voices have been heard this weekend, and we hope this is only the start of voices from this community being heard more widely in our church. I mentioned we made a special effort to build up the LGBTQ community at this conference. Our meals, our social hours, even the transitions, the long hot walks between buildings, they were opportunities to build community, and I felt that that really happened. From my vantage point, it looked like folks were really taking time to get to know one another, share contact information, make plans about staying in touch, and this is very much just the beginning. Our work here has only just begun. But you have some homework. We want you to leave here to take these experiences and do what you can to bring them back home. Bring them to your parishes, your schools, your workplaces, your own communities, maybe just your homes if that's all you feel comfortable doing. We're hoping that this conference was a catalyst for bringing into the reality the kinds of communities that we want for our church, for our loved ones, for each other. Now, many folks have been asking me what our plans are for outreach for next year, and I'm excited to say that we are exploring ways to bring about this community building to more parts of the country. We're looking at regional events, different ways to connect folks online, really build this community in places that maybe have a large LGBT community already, and we can serve as a bridge to bring folks together, and maybe in places that don't, but there's still people who want to learn how to be a more welcoming church. We'll be out on the road, we'll be exploring different ways of building community, and we're excited that we'll be back together as a big national conference in 2026, and we hope that you will be able to join us for that. In the coming days, you'll receive a link to a survey. Once you're home and not as tired, spend some time thinking about what you experienced here and giving some real feedback to us. This conference this year was a little different than previous years if you've been back in the past, and that's because of the feedback we received on this survey. So your thoughts really do shape the kinds of programming we do, the speakers we bring in, the way we structure these events. So I hope you'll take some time tomorrow, Tuesday, give us your thoughts, give us candid feedback, give us honest feedback. And finally, I just want to thank the team that made Outreach 2024 happen. Our entire team, certainly, and in America, but especially our volunteers and our benefactors, and each of you who brought a moving spirit, a supportive energy to this conference. We couldn't have done any of this without you. It wasn't done for you. It was a group effort for everyone. So thank you so much for all your energy and positive thoughts over the course of the weekend. As you leave, there's a small treat, a very small token of our appreciation for your journey. Thank you for being here. I'm going to invite Father Jim up to give a final blessing, and then we will be on our way.
Well, we began with, can you hear me okay? Yeah. We began with gratitude, and we're going to end with gratitude. I don't want to belabor what Mike said, but I want to extend my own thanks also to, I don't know where he is, Ryan DeCorpo, who is our managing editor. Familiar? He's... Don't worry, I'm not going to name everybody. Alessandra Rose, who really did wonderful work from our development team at American Outreach, and also wherever she is. And also, because he couldn't thank himself, our new executive director, Michael O'Loughlin. Michael is, he's probably heard me say this many times, Michael is the perfect person for this job, and this is the perfect job for Michael. And so we're so happy to have him. I am very happy that he's here. It was kind of funny. We were trying to come up with a title for me because Mike is executive director now, right? And we said, well, what are we going to call Jim Martin? And it was like, well, how about editor-in-chief? No, we have one of those. That's Sam Sawyer at America. How about president? No, we have one of those too. You can't call him that. So the only thing we could come up with is founder, which is a little embarrassing. And my Jesuit confreres at my community, when they heard that, said, what are you, George Washington or something? So I'm very happy that our executive director has really spearheaded this entire weekend. So can we give him a round of applause? And as Michael said, this is not going to take long, don't worry. As Michael said, thanks to all of you. We know many of you came from, Belgium, Italy, Korea, all over the place, even Arlington. And very grateful that you made the effort to come. I know what it's like to go to conferences. You're maybe not sleeping as well. You're dodging raindrops. You're dealing with unfamiliar places. Thank you for coming, and thank you for helping, as Mike said, to build community. That is our goal. One of Mike's wonderful contributions to outreach, one of many, was to really help us focus on, as he said, elevating and celebrating some of the good things that are happening, right? Not just sort of focusing on the struggles. Okay, so thank you to Mike. And what I'd like to do before we leave is just, we haven't had too many moments of silence. Let's just take a few moments of silence, a few moments of prayer. What I'd like you to, this is not going to take a long time, don't worry. We want you to get your special treat afterwards. Just take a deep breath, get a little comfortable, close your eyes, and I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of an examine. So right now, just remember one insight that you received, one aha moment, one conversation that really moved you this past weekend. Just think about it, savor it, thank God for it. Now think about one person you met that really moved you or challenged you or encouraged you or inspired you. Just think about that person. Call them to mind. Thank God for that person. Now think about one person in your family, at home, in your parish, in your school, that you'd like to bring this message of celebration to. And now let us pray. Loving God, we thank you so much for bringing us together this weekend. Thank you for keeping us all safe. Thank you for helping us to share best practices, build community, especially worship together in your name. As we go out, we ask you to remember to be with us and help us remember that when we are together under your holy name, we are, as St. Ignatius liked to say, united in hearts and minds, even though we might be separated. Fill us with your Spirit and give us the courage to always proclaim your word. And we ask all this through Christ our Lord. Amen. And since I can do this, may Almighty God bless you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Go in peace. Amen.